The ancient physician felt his patient's wrist grow cold beneath his fingers. King Hezekiah of Judah, one of the most powerful rulers of his time, lay motionless on his bed. For 15 agonizing minutes, there was no breath, no heartbeat, no sign of life whatsoever. The kingdom mourned. Preparations for burial began. But then something extraordinary happened. Something that would challenge everything we think we know about the boundary between life and death. Hezekiah's eyes suddenly opened, and he drew a deep, shuddering breath. This wasn't a miracle in the traditional sense, though many called it that. This was something far more mysterious, a glimpse into those crucial first moments after what we call clinical death, a realm that modern medicine is only beginning to understand, but one that ancient biblical texts have been describing with startling accuracy for thousands of years. What really happens in those first moments when our heart stops beating? When our brain waves flatten? When by every medical definition we have died? The answer might surprise you because, according to biblical accounts and an increasing body of modern research, death isn't the instant switch we once believed it to be. It's a process, one that unfolds over minutes, sometimes hours, and in rare cases can even be reversed. The story of Hezekiah isn't unique in biblical literature. Throughout the ancient texts, we find detailed accounts of people who crossed that threshold and returned, bringing with them descriptions of experiences so vivid and consistent that they've puzzled scholars for centuries. But perhaps more intriguing is how these ancient accounts align with what neuroscientists and medical researchers are discovering today about consciousness, the dying process, and those mysterious near-death experiences that millions of people report. Dr. Sam Parnia, one of the world's leading researchers on consciousness and death, made a startling discovery that would have made perfect sense to biblical writers. Consciousness can persist for minutes, sometimes longer, after clinical death. His research at major hospitals has documented cases where patients, declared clinically dead, later recalled detailed conversations and events that occurred while they were supposedly unconscious. This isn't mysticism, it's measurable, repeatable science that's forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the dying process. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the mysteries that have captivated humanity for millennia. I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from our global community of truth seekers. And if you're finding value in these explorations of ancient wisdom and modern discovery, consider leaving a super thanks to help us continue bringing you these in-depth investigations. The biblical account of death begins not with the final breath, but with something far more nuanced. The Hebrew word nephesh, often translated as soul, literally means breathing being. But here's where it gets fascinating. Biblical texts describe multiple components of human consciousness that separate during the dying process, each following its own timeline. The ruach, or spirit, is described as returning to God who gave it. The physical body returns to dust. But there's a third component, what some scholars call the conscious essence, that appears to experience a transitional period. This isn't abstract theology. It's a detailed description of a process that matches what we're learning from modern resuscitation science. Dr. Parnia's studies have shown that when someone's heart stops, brain activity doesn't cease immediately. Instead, there's a cascade of neurological events that can last up to 20 minutes or more. During this time, patients often report experiences of extraordinary clarity, reviewing their lives, encountering deceased relatives, or having profound spiritual experiences. But the biblical accounts go deeper than modern science has yet reached. They describe not just the biological process of dying, but the actual experience of consciousness as it transitions from physical to spiritual reality. And these descriptions, written thousands of years before we understood the first thing about neuroscience, contain details that are proving remarkably accurate. Consider the account of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. As he was being stoned to death, he reported seeing the heavens opened and having a vision of Jesus. But here's what's remarkable about this account. It describes his experience while he was actively dying, not after he was already dead. Modern research has found that people often have their most profound near-death experiences during the dying process itself, when the brain is starved of oxygen but still functioning. The visions Stephen described match the phenomenology of what researchers now call terminal lucidity, moments of extraordinary clarity that often occur just before death. The biblical text provides another crucial detail that scientists are now confirming. The experience of time during the dying process is dramatically altered. Patients who have been clinically dead for minutes often report experiences that seem to last hours or even days. This matches biblical descriptions of spiritual encounters where vast amounts of information or experience are compressed into brief moments of physical time. Take the account of Ezekiel's vision by the river Chebar. He describes being in the Spirit for what seems like an extended period, receiving detailed visions and instructions. Yet the narrative suggests this occurred during a relatively brief physical time frame. Modern neuroscience has found that when the brain is in certain altered states, including those that occur during the dying process, the normal experience of linear time breaks down completely. But perhaps the most intriguing biblical insight into the first moments after death comes from an unexpected source: the account of Jesus' crucifixion. The detailed description of his words and actions during the dying process provide what may be the most medically accurate account of death and resuscitation in ancient literature. When Jesus tells the thief beside him, "Today you will be with me in paradise," he's not making a theological statement about the afterlife. He's describing the immediate experience of consciousness as it transitions beyond physical death. Modern medical understanding of crucifixion reveals that death typically occurred through asphyxiation. The victim's ability to breathe gradually diminished until consciousness faded. But the Gospel accounts describe Jesus as maintaining clear consciousness right up until the moment he gave up his spirit, a phrase that investigators now recognize as describing the moment when someone consciously lets go of their connection to physical life. This phenomenon, called volitional death, is well documented in modern medical literature, though science still can't fully explain how it works. The 3 days between Jesus' death and resurrection provide another window into biblical understanding of post-death consciousness. Rather than describing this period as a blank void, biblical texts refer to Jesus being in the Spirit and interacting with others who had died. This concept of continued conscious existence immediately after physical death is being supported by an unexpected source: quantum physics research into the nature of consciousness itself. Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist and consciousness researcher, has proposed that consciousness might not be generated by the brain, but rather processed by it. If consciousness exists as a fundamental property of the universe, what physicists call a quantum field, then the death of the brain wouldn't necessarily mean the extinction of consciousness. It would mean the end of the brain's ability to process consciousness, but not the end of consciousness itself. This theory, controversial but gaining support, would explain how biblical figures could maintain conscious awareness and even interact with others after physical death. The biblical concept of Sheol or Hades takes on new meaning in this context. Rather than being a physical place, these terms appear to describe a state of consciousness, a realm where those who have died continue to exist in an aware state while their physical bodies decay. The Hebrew word Sheol literally means the place of inquiry, suggesting a state where consciousness continues to process and understand reality, just without physical constraints. This understanding transforms how we read accounts like that of King Saul consulting the medium at Endor. When the spirit of the prophet Samuel appears, he's described as being disturbed or brought up from Sheol. The text presents this as Samuel's actual consciousness being temporarily reconnected to physical reality, not as a supernatural magic trick. If consciousness can exist independently of the brain, such communication between the living and recently deceased becomes theoretically possible, even if practically difficult. Modern research into terminal lucidity provides another fascinating parallel to biblical accounts. Dr. Michael Naum has documented hundreds of cases where people with severe dementia or brain damage suddenly regain complete mental clarity in the hours or days before death. Their personalities return, their memories become crystal clear, and they often express profound insights about life and death. Then they die peacefully, as if this final burst of consciousness was preparing them for transition. Biblical accounts describe similar phenomena. Jacob, on his deathbed, suddenly demonstrates remarkable clarity as he blesses each of his sons with detailed prophecies about their futures. Moses, at 120 years old, is described as having undimmed vision and unabated vigor just before his death. These weren't miraculous healings, they were examples of the same terminal lucidity that modern medicine documents but doesn't fully understand. The process of dying described in biblical texts follows a specific sequence that matches modern medical understanding remarkably well. First comes the recognition that death is approaching, what medical professionals call active dying. Biblical figures often announce their impending death with startling accuracy. Abraham died in a good old age, full of years. Isaac breathed his last and died. These phrases suggest a conscious participation in the dying process, not a sudden, unexpected cessation of life. Next comes the separation of what biblical texts call the spirit from the body. This appears to be a gradual process, not an instant disconnection. Modern research has found that consciousness often fades gradually during the dying process, with patients moving in and out of awareness as their brain receives varying levels of oxygen. The biblical description of this as a giving up of the spirit suggests a similar gradual release rather than an abrupt termination. But here's where biblical accounts diverge from purely materialistic explanations. They describe continued conscious experience after this separation occurs. The parable of Lazarus and the rich man, whether taken literally or metaphorically, describes both men as maintaining their personalities, memories, and ability to experience sensation after death. The rich man recognizes Lazarus, remembers his earthly life, and feels thirst. This isn't a description of resurrection. It's an account of consciousness continuing immediately after physical death. Modern near-death experience research has documented remarkably similar reports. Patients describe maintaining their sense of identity after clinical death, recognizing deceased relatives and friends, and having clear memories of both their earthly life and their experience while dead. Dr. Jeffrey Long, who has collected thousands of near-death experience accounts, found that people consistently report heightened awareness and clearer thinking during these experiences, not the confused, hallucination-like states that would be expected if these were simply the brain's final neurochemical fireworks. The biblical account of the Transfiguration provides another intriguing glimpse into post-death consciousness. Moses and Elijah, both long dead, appear in recognizable form and engage in conversation with Jesus. They maintain their individual personalities and appear to have knowledge of current events on earth. For ancient readers, this wasn't a supernatural anomaly. It was confirmation of what they already understood about consciousness continuing after physical death. What makes this account particularly interesting is that it describes the deceased as having physical-like forms that could be seen and recognized, but forms that were also somehow different from ordinary physical bodies. This matches reports from modern near-death experiences, where people often describe themselves as having a body that feels completely solid and real to them, but which can pass through physical objects and doesn't follow normal physical laws. The resurrection accounts themselves provide the most detailed biblical descriptions of what happens when consciousness is reconnected to physical form after death. But these aren't simple resuscitations like we might see in a modern emergency room. The risen Jesus has a body that can eat food and be touched, but can also appear suddenly in locked rooms. This suggests something more complex than just consciousness returning to the same physical form. It describes consciousness being connected to a transformed physical reality. Dr. Gary Habermas, who has spent decades studying resurrection accounts, notes that biblical descriptions consistently present the risen Jesus as the same person, with the same memories and personality, but with a body that operates according to different physical laws. This concept of consciousness maintaining continuity while being connected to a transformed physical form appears in other biblical accounts as well, suggesting it was understood as part of the natural progression of existence beyond death. The timing details in biblical resurrection accounts are also significant. Lazarus was dead for 4 days before being resurrected. Jesus was dead for 3 days. These weren't immediate resuscitations like modern cases where patients are revived after minutes of clinical death. They describe consciousness being reconnected to physical form after extended periods of separation. This suggests that the biblical understanding of death included the concept that consciousness continues independently of physical form, at least for a time. Modern research into consciousness and quantum physics is beginning to provide theoretical frameworks that could explain such phenomena. If consciousness exists as a fundamental property of reality rather than an emergent property of complex brains, then it could theoretically maintain coherence independently of physical form and potentially be reconnected to physical reality under the right conditions. The biblical concept of different types of resurrection also aligns with modern understanding of the dying process. Some people, like Lazarus, are described as returning to their ordinary physical existence and presumably dying again later. Others, like Jesus, are described as being resurrected to a transformed state that transcends ordinary physical limitations. This suggests that biblical writers understood death and resurrection as processes with multiple possible outcomes, not single events with predetermined results. What's particularly fascinating is how biblical accounts describe the experience of those who are resurrected. Lazarus is notably silent about his experience during the 4 days he was dead. This matches modern near-death experience research, which has found that people who are dead for longer periods often report difficulty integrating their experience or communicating about it afterward. The longer someone is clinically dead, the more challenging they often find it to describe or even remember their experience upon return. Jesus, on the other hand, provides specific details about his post-death experience. He describes having visited the spirits in prison and having led captivity captive. These aren't vague spiritual metaphors, they're specific accounts of conscious activity during the period between his death and resurrection. The fact that he could provide these details suggests that consciousness not only continued during this period, but retained the ability to form and access memories. The biblical understanding of immediate post-death experience also includes the concept of judgment or evaluation. This isn't described as an external process imposed by a distant deity, but as something that happens naturally as part of the transition beyond physical life. The parable of the sheep and goats describes this evaluation as based on actions taken during physical life, particularly how people treated others who were suffering. Modern near-death experience research has documented remarkably similar reports of what many patients describe as a life review. During this experience, people report reliving key moments from their lives, often from the perspective of others they affected. They describe understanding with crystal clarity the consequences of their actions and choices. This process is typically described not as punishment, but as education, a natural part of consciousness understanding its own development and impact. Dr. Kenneth Ring, a pioneer in near-death experience research, has found that people consistently report this life review as being guided by beings of light who show them not judgment, but compassion and understanding. The purpose seems to be learning and growth, not condemnation. This matches biblical descriptions of divine judgment as being based on perfect knowledge and motivated by love rather than vengeance. The question of whether near-death experiences represent actual glimpses of post-death reality, or simply the brain's final neurochemical activity, remains hotly debated in scientific circles. But the consistency of reports across cultures, time periods, and religious backgrounds suggests something more than random hallucinations. When someone who has never heard of near-death experiences reports traveling through a tunnel toward a bright light and encountering deceased relatives, it's worth considering whether they might be describing something real. Biblical accounts provide additional evidence for the reality of post-death consciousness experiences. These weren't written by people who had heard thousands of similar stories and were unconsciously influenced by cultural expectations. They were written by individuals from different time periods and cultural contexts, yet they describe experiences with remarkable consistency to what modern researchers are documenting. The Apostle Paul provides perhaps the most detailed biblical account of consciousness, existing independently of physical form. He describes being caught up to the third heaven, and whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. This wasn't a near-death experience in the modern sense. Paul wasn't dying, but it was an experience of consciousness operating independently of normal physical constraints and accessing information and experiences that weren't available through ordinary sensory channels. Paul's uncertainty about whether he was in his body during this experience is particularly interesting. It suggests that the experience was so real, so vivid, that he couldn't tell whether it was happening to his physical form or to his consciousness alone. This matches reports from modern out-of-body experiences, where people often describe the experience as feeling more real than ordinary physical reality. The biblical concept of spiritual bodies also provides insight into understanding post-death consciousness. Paul describes resurrection bodies as being spiritual rather than natural, but still bodies nonetheless. This isn't a description of becoming incorporeal spirits, but of consciousness being connected to a different type of physical form, one that operates according to expanded physical laws rather than the limitations we currently experience. Modern physics is beginning to provide theoretical frameworks that could support such concepts. Quantum field theory suggests that matter and energy are interchangeable, and that the hard boundaries between physical and non-physical reality may be illusions created by our limited perception. If consciousness can influence quantum fields directly, and some research suggests it can, then the biblical concept of spiritual bodies that can interact with physical reality while transcending physical limitations becomes theoretically possible. The biblical timeline for resurrection and final judgment also provides clues about the nature of post-death consciousness. Rather than describing immediate final destinations, biblical texts typically describe an intermediate period where the dead await resurrection. During this time, they're described as conscious and aware, but not yet in their final state. This suggests that the first moments after death are just that, the beginning of a longer process rather than an immediate arrival at a final destination. This concept aligns with modern research, suggesting that consciousness might continue developing and evolving even after physical death. If consciousness is fundamental to reality rather than just a product of brain activity, then there's no reason it would stop growing and changing simply because it's no longer connected to a physical brain. The biblical concept of progressive sanctification, the idea that spiritual development continues throughout existence, might extend beyond physical death. The practical implications of biblical teachings about the first moments after death are profound. Rather than describing death as something to be feared, biblical accounts consistently present it as a transition to be understood and prepared for. The emphasis is on how we live now, knowing that consciousness continues and that our actions and choices have consequences that extend beyond physical life. This understanding transforms how we approach dying and death. If consciousness continues immediately after physical death, then the way we die becomes as important as the way we live. Biblical accounts consistently describe righteous people as dying peacefully, often with final words that demonstrate continued clarity and spiritual awareness. This isn't just coincidence. It suggests that a life lived with spiritual awareness leads naturally to a death experienced with spiritual awareness. Modern hospice care has rediscovered many of these principles. Rather than fighting death with every possible medical intervention, hospice care focuses on ensuring that people can die with dignity, surrounded by love, and with opportunities to complete unfinished spiritual and emotional business. The result is often exactly what biblical accounts describe: peaceful deaths, where people maintain clarity and express profound insights right up until their final moments. The biblical emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation takes on new meaning when we understand that consciousness continues immediately after death. If we're going to maintain our memories and personalities beyond physical life, then the emotional and spiritual state we're in when we die becomes critically important. Biblical teachings about forgiveness aren't just about improving our earthly relationships. They're about ensuring that consciousness transitions beyond physical life free from the burdens of resentment and unresolved conflict. Perhaps most importantly, biblical accounts of the first moments after death suggest that physical death isn't the end of the story, but rather a new chapter in an ongoing existence. This doesn't minimize the reality of grief and loss. When someone dies, they're no longer accessible to us through ordinary physical means. But it does suggest that the person we knew and loved continues to exist, continues to be conscious, and may even continue to develop and grow. Recent research into after-death communications has found that a significant percentage of bereaved individuals report some form of contact with deceased loved ones. These experiences often bring comfort and healing, and they frequently include information that the bereaved person couldn't have known otherwise. While science doesn't yet have adequate tools to verify such experiences, the consistency and transformative nature of these reports suggests they may represent genuine interactions with continued consciousness. The biblical account of death as sleep also takes on new meaning in this context. Sleep isn't unconsciousness. It's an altered state of consciousness where we process experiences, form memories, and sometimes have vivid dreams that feel completely real while we're experiencing them. If death is like sleep, as biblical texts often suggest, then it might involve similar processing of life experiences while consciousness continues in an altered but aware state. This understanding provides comfort without minimizing the reality of what death means for those left behind. While consciousness may continue immediately after physical death, the relationship between the living and the dead is fundamentally changed. The biblical concept of resurrection suggests that this separation is temporary, but it's still a real separation that involves genuine grief and loss. As we reach the end of our exploration into what the Bible actually reveals about the first moments after death, we're left with a picture that's both comforting and challenging. Comforting because it suggests that death isn't the absolute end we often fear it to be. Challenging because it implies that how we live has consequences that extend far beyond our physical existence. If you found this deep dive into biblical wisdom and modern research valuable, consider supporting our work with a super thanks. Your support helps us continue exploring these fascinating intersections between ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science. The question isn't whether these biblical accounts are literally true in every detail. The question is whether they're pointing toward truths about consciousness and death that we're only beginning to understand. As modern science continues to probe the mysteries of consciousness, the dying process, and the possibility of survival beyond physical death, we may find that these ancient texts were far more scientifically accurate than we ever imagined. What we can say with confidence is that the biblical understanding of the first moments after death is far more sophisticated and nuanced than it's often given credit for. Rather than primitive mythology, these accounts provide detailed descriptions of consciousness transitioning beyond physical constraints while maintaining personal identity and awareness. Whether that consciousness continues indefinitely, as biblical texts suggest, remains one of the great mysteries we're still exploring. But perhaps the most important insight from biblical accounts of death is this: how we die is intimately connected to how we live. The peace and clarity that biblical figures often demonstrate in their final moments isn't accidental. It's the natural result of lives lived with spiritual awareness and preparation for the transition beyond physical existence. In the end, the biblical teaching about the first moments after death might be less about what happens to us when we die and more about how we can live in such a way that death becomes not an ending to be feared, but a doorway to be approached with confidence and peace. The story of King Hezekiah that opened our exploration reminds us that the boundary between life and death may be far more permeable than we've traditionally believed. Whether his return from clinical death was divine intervention, natural process, or something beyond our current understanding, his experience points toward the central biblical teaching. Consciousness, in some form, continues beyond the moment when our hearts stop beating. And that continuation is shaped by how we've chosen to live, love, and prepare for the ultimate transition that awaits us all.